Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to give everyone just one more minute to come into the room from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Christina Eberbach. I'm one of the co-chairs for the University and College Consortium for Human Rights Education, which is one of the co-sponsors for this wonderful event we have today, a book discussion of the editors of Emancipatory Human Rights in the University, Felisa Tibbitts and Andre Keet. Thank you both so much for being here. And thank you all of you for joining us, and also welcome to any of the co-authors or the authors or contributors to the book that may also be here. Before I go ahead and briefly introduce the book and the editors, the University and College Consortium for Human Rights Education would like to very briefly acknowledge and say congratulations to our 2023 recipient of the UCC HRE Human Rights in Higher Education Award, Dr. Anya Mir. And we'll be sending out a separate announcement, and we will also be celebrating her on our December 7th event that'll be co-sponsored with Human Rights Educators USA. But as this is our first webinar since she received the award, we also wanted to briefly acknowledge her here. So moving on, again, thank you to our co-editors for being here. This volume explores the application of human rights to higher education through a critical lens, combining theoretical and applied perspectives. It asks what a human rights framework grounded in liberation and justice can offer to ways of working and teaching practices in human rights education. Underlying the value of applying human rights is a framework in understanding and designing higher education transformation. The book will be of great interest to scholars, researchers, and postgraduate students in the fields of sociology of education, human rights education, higher education, and social justice education, as well as many more. Felisa Tibbitts is chair of the Human Rights Education in the Department of Law, Economics, and Governance at Utrecht University, and adjunct assistant professor at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. She is also UNESCO chair in human rights in higher education. Her research interests include human rights and global democratic citizenship education, curriculum policy and reform, critical pedagogy, education and social movements, and human rights in higher education transformation. She was a Fulbright Fellow at Lund University, Sweden in fall 2014, and a Human Rights Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. She was a full-time lecturer at the Teachers College of Columbia University between 2016 and 2020. Thank you so much for being here. Andre Keet currently holds a research chair for critical studies in higher education transformation and is the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation at Nelson Mandela University. He is a former visiting professor at the Center for Race, Education, and Decoloniality at Carnegie School of Education, Leeds Beckett University, UK, and the 2018 Marsha Lillian Gladstein Visiting Professor of Human Rights at the University of Connecticut. Andre served as Director and Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the South African Human Rights Commission and on the Commission for Gender Equality before joining the university sector. Since entering the higher education field, he has held professional positions at the Universities of Pretoria, Fort Hare, and Free State. He has been serving as a transformation advisor and practitioner in various capacities in the sector. Andre's research and postgraduate supervision focuses on radical approaches to the study of higher education, such as critical and abolitionist university studies. So again, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us. I'm going to turn it over to you, and we look forward to a wonderful discussion after your presentation.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Christina, and for the invitation. I'm speaking on behalf of Andre and myself. We're just delighted that you reached out for us to join you in this, and everyone else who's here, in a conversation about the book. If anybody has worked on a book, you know that it is a labor of love, and both those things are true for us as well. It was a lot of work, And it was also work that we really enjoyed because of the delight of having the opportunity to work with each other and with our marvelous authors. I'm seeing now the people that are in this room. It's so lovely. So many friends and colleagues I haven't seen in some time. Welcome everyone who's here. And thank you for taking time to join us today for the celebration of this book. So Andre, would you like to say anything before I kind of give an overview for the book, the background and the content? Anything you'd like to say?
Okay. Yeah, just to say that, yeah, apart from being, hard work, it's also, yeah, exciting work and also enjoyable in a sense, and trying to put together various strands of how to approach the study of the university with a critical lens. So yeah, it's it's been a for me at least, apart from being hard work, also a lovely journey, and also always lovely working with Felisa, of course. And thank you so much for inviting us into this space.
Great, thank you. So what we thought we'd do is really simple. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about how the book was conceptualized, and then I think we just do sort of open Q&A. With that, I think I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started. Let's go slideshow. So this is what the book looks like, the cover. And Andre and I have worked together in the past. It was really fortunate. We've had a couple of book events already, so we've actually had the opportunity to tell the story. So I think I'm going to tell a little bit of the story. So Andre and I were both working in the civil society sector. Well, the South African Human Rights Commission is not the civil society sector, but we were both not working in higher education until about 10, 12 years ago. We ended up migrating, both of us, into higher ed. And of course, Andres had a very special mandate in South Africa in the different universities that he has been associated with now, happily with Nelson Mandela University. But over time, as we have collaborated and worked together, I know, speaking for myself, I've always so much appreciated his outlook and way of thinking. So I'm sure all of us have colleagues that we get together and it's just very fertile. You have different points of view and you exchange them, and you sometimes land in new places, new ways of thinking. So that was part of the background, really, of the personal background and professional background for this book, because human rights and that framework has been, of course, under duress, under assault in some cases, in contexts. And yet there is this potential, it's radical potential, which is what we're calling the emancipatory human rights frame, that is still there to be used. And so what we wondered about, and which is the context for this book, is if we could put it together, this notion of emancipatory human rights, meaning emancipatory in the sense of ensuring everyone's human dignity, and put that in the human rights, that in the context of higher education, in conjunction with other discourses such as decoloniality or anti-racism or Africanization, and see what we might come up with. So quite deliberately, we have half of the authors as global South authors, half global North, to really also to try to see what we might find if we put together a lot of these different kinds of frames of thinking, with the question of how we can use the university to promote emancipatory human rights. So a little bit better background in general for higher education. I think many of you are in higher education, but it's quite remarkable, actually, that the number of people going to higher ed is just increasing, or has been increasing substantially. So the World Bank stats between 2000 and 2022 tell us that higher education actually enrollment doubled, which is really incredible. And that is, you would have to look at it regionally to sort of break that out, but in general, it's just been going up in all parts of the world. And in a way, this raises or reminds us of the question of what then might be, if you will, the social mission or the social justice mission, particularly of universities. If so many young people are going to university, if it's becoming a rite of passage for so many more young people, if it's becoming less elitist, which I think is a wonderful positive, and what might we then, what new questions might we have, or what renewed questions might we have about the role of the university in terms of preparing young people to, take on roles in society. And moreover, universities are only going to increase in their power, if you will, if so many people are attending. So is there a potential there for the university, an enlarged potential for promoting social justice that might be explored? And that was part of the rationale for this book. So we've got some writing questions. And here they are. There's two of them. The next slide has a few more. So what can a human rights framework, grounded in liberation and justice in particular, we can talk more about that, offer higher education's ways of working and teaching practices? Because we know that the higher education setting is not is problematic. In many universities, decoloniality is happening. We have now also on US campuses in particular, but I think also in other campuses, conflicts amongst students and student groups and faculty around the conflict that's happening right now in Gaza. So there's a lot that's showing up on campuses now where they're being required to respond to essentially world events or long-standing problems like history of coloniality or slavery. And when we think about the university's commitment to social justice, what does that really mean in practice? How can we think about moving beyond a sort of superficial engagement with social justice, and really think deeply about the university with all its blemishes, if you will? So, and in particular, as I mentioned before, recognizing that there are different discourses, not all of us working in the university setting with an interest in social justice or feminism or anti-racism would characterize our work as human rights related. But if we set the human rights frame there and we juxtapose it against some of these other discourses, where do we see the intersections? Where do we see a kind of vibrant conversation maybe that could help us really further think about what the university might look like? It was going to be, again, focused on emancipatory human rights. So those are our guiding questions. We put out actually a call for papers, well, for chapters, I might say. Those of you who written books, you know the process. So we did that, did some outreach to some people we really wanted to have in the book. And over time, he ended up with, landed, I think, about 15 chapters. No, 4 times 4 is about, well, 14 chapters, including the introduction and the conclusion. And happily, we could sort of cluster these into these different sections. So we ended up organizing the book according to the chapters we got. The first part is theory. The second is really looking at what's happening inside the university in relation to student activism, for example, or teaching and learning processes. And I'm going to present briefly each of the chapters, just the titles, so you'll see exactly what's in each section. And then outside the university, again, reflecting back on the civic mission or social justice mission of the universities, what did some of the authors have to say about that role in terms of the work of the university? So section 1 is the theoretical section, and we began with a kickoff with something rather traditional, actually. I pulled together a chapter that really looked at what the international human rights standards had to say about right to education at higher education level, and I can talk a little bit about the results of that chapter. But the idea was to first just put out there what the international human rights standards did have to say about higher education. What hard standards, meaning legally binding treaties, might have facets that we could draw on to promote, for example, non-discrimination or equal access to education at higher education level, and what are also some of the sort of people's soft policies around right to education, typically applied at younger school levels that might be also potentially applied at higher ed. And then we moved into Andre and his colleagues' chapter, you can see, called Critique of Disputations. And here we had Andre and his colleagues really putting together some of these different discourses: human rights, Africanization, decolonization, and the project of decentered critical university studies, which is very much what he's working on now. And of course, he and I are the ones that you are having in this in this event. So it may be that you want to ask us questions about our respective chapters. We had two more chapters in the theoretical section. One was really looking at epistemic violence and human rights in the American Academy. So here looking at, again, the nature of knowledge and knowing, voices left out, perspectives not included in, and maybe an agenda for decoloniality at the university and university studies. And then extending on this treatment of decoloniality, Michelina Zembeles, who has written quite a bit on critical studies and human rights education and peace education. And he also looked at decoloniality as a potential, if you will, for emancipatory human rights at the university. So we then have another 4 chapters looking inside the university, we called it. We began with student activism. I mean, part of the inspiration for me for the book also was seeing what has been happening with young activists, both in higher education and even younger levels of high schools, and to see, and this particular chapter looks at student activism in the context of what, neoliberalism basically in a university that may or may not be really receptive to student activism, or only, again, having very superficial and short-term responses to student activists and their demands. So this is a chapter on student activism. The next chapter, a very interesting chapter written by Paul Grady, who's now a UNESCO chair in, I think it's Human Rights and Human Rights Defenders. It's not the correct title, but it's around Human Rights Defenders, which is amazing. He's connecting that up with the higher education sector. And he wrote this chapter with several colleagues who are working in either South Africa or in Uganda, and they looked at the universities as sites of protection, but using gender-based violence as a kind of the case study. Very, very interesting look at the universities as sites of protection, and human rights is one of the frameworks that's included. Very interesting. Our next chapter took us to Mexico, where Regina Cortina and Romina Quezana looked at the feminism, using a feminist lens, looked at both the progress, but also the lack of progress in terms of women's advancement in academia in this particular university, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, which is one of the oldest universities. And although they had a lot to say about women progressing in terms of having academic appointments, what the chapter did show was a kind of glass ceiling in terms of women getting really hot, very prestigious research appointments. So there was still sort of room to grow, if you will. And finally, Andre again had a chapter here with Rachel Karnoff looking at human rights curriculum programming in South African universities. So this was an empirical study looking to see where human rights were showing up in terms of curriculum. So in terms of concentrations, majors, but also courses. A very fascinating and sobering study, again, on the limitations of human rights getting planted deeply in universities in South Africa. And this despite, as we know, the very explicit mention of human rights in the South African Constitution. But if we've been following the South African progress over the last years, again, some grave disappointment about the failure of human rights to really engender all the changes that were hoped for post-apartheid, which of course Andre can speak with about at great length. So that was looking inside the university. And then we pulled together some chapters. Partly it was just convenience. We need to have 4 chapters here. These were the best candidates looking outside the university. So we begin this section with a really, again, fascinating study. Here, an example of a collaboration at Nelson Mandela University, where Andre is based, a collaboration between some colleagues as researchers assisting locals, if you will, in a township near Nelson Mandela University, a township that was undertaking a development project. Andre could probably speak more about this. And this was a very, again, sobering, a kind of intellectual engagement with the potentialities and also the limitations of having a kind of an academic team collaborating to do research on a transition project, development focused in South Africa, and some of what worked well and what didn't work as well in that collaboration. But of course, a beautiful example also of what universities might do in terms of community partnerships, which of course is a very big area for thinking of the civic mission of the universities or the social justice missions, how they're relating to organizations and individuals right in the vicinity, the neighborhood, if you will, of the university. The second chapter in this section is also a really fascinating one, which for me opens up a broader area of thinking around, in this case, they're looking at migration studies, higher education and emergencies, but to me, it also links up with this area of work in universities where we have collaborations with other universities, where we have maybe student exchanges and visits, and this question of how that gets played out when we have universities that have greater privilege and resources than others, right? That they have collaborations with. So this is particularly looking at migration studies and education and emergencies. But again, as with many other chapters in the book, because it is, as you can see, rather eclectic in terms of the different topics that are addressed, our idea was that we would open up this a discussion around these different facets of the university and its ways of working to engender further studies and considerations. So this was, I think, that sort of door opening for thinking further about migration studies, other studies that involve thinking about international issues, vulnerable groups, and again, student exchanges, that kind of thing. The last two chapters, and this is then my wrap up for the introduction, looked at human rights education in higher education, in particular higher education for professional groups. And so depending what country you're thinking of, this is either a separate program in the United States, for example, health workers, social workers, teachers, our psychologists are typically doing a master's program of some kind in order to get certification. But in other countries like the Netherlands, for example, it's a program that you enroll in just essentially after high school, and you do a certain amount of studies, and it's not considered an academic, quote unquote, area of line of study, but it is definitely higher education, preparing people for work in the field. So we have Chapter 11 is looking at some of the most very exciting developments in the area of psychology and social work training. The authors are Dutch, but the work that they're doing is linked up with internationals. And it really explains not only the rationale for why the human rights frame fits with the ethical norms that we typically do find in these, these professional development programs, but to also talk about looking at using human rights to look critically at the history of these fields. For example, in the field of psychology, the history of eugenics and how racism was actually promoted through the science of psychology. So also recognizing historically the difficulties at times, with these disciplines and how they fostered what we now see as problematic and disgraceful even views of human beings. And so we have the last chapter looking at U.S. professional education, again, more broadly, extending this treatment of higher education and higher ed. Very exciting things happening there. And this is very much, I think, at the heart of also the organizations that are sponsoring this book talk. Thank you. Again, very much dedicated to this question about how we can promote higher education in terms of teaching and learning in higher education. But of course, as you can see from the book, really thinking more broadly about the university as, in my view, as a human rights actor. How, if we think of the university as a human rights actor, what does that lead us to think about in terms of not only teaching and learning, but policies, practices, the culture of the university, and so forth. So that's the background on the book, so you have an idea about it. And I guess with that, I just give it back to Christina, I guess.
Thank you so much, Felisa. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or you're also welcome to add a question into the chat that we will open it up for discussion.
Maybe while people are thinking, I think, Christy, you had already asked a question, and it was something you learned from doing the book. So since I've been talking a bit, Andre, I'd like to invite you to address that, and maybe I'll come in after you. What did you learn from doing this book?
The most straightforward questions are always the most difficult to respond to, isn't it? I think that the one thing is that I think that the field has been growing, but also in the same way that it's been growing, also being diversifying. Now it's very, I would not use the word fragmentation, but rather the word perhaps diversifying may be more accurate. That is that people enter both the discourse and praxis of human rights from a variety of angles, and they of course are distributed on a spectrum of so many kinds of ways in which one can do this work. So that is the first one. But then of course it also creates forms of and I'm not so sure whether one should drive at the idea of unity within scholarly work, because that's precisely what scholarly work should not be about, but a broad set of contestations that can come through the work. And of course, if you do a kind of deep dive into the thematics and the approaches that people deploy within the chapters of the book, you will certainly see those diverse ways in which the idea and ideal of human rights is pursued. So in a sense, almost like just confirming this particular growth as well. I wonder what would a thematic analysis of the growth of human rights education over the past, say, 10 years show. We have had that massive growth in the 1990s and the 2000s, and I was just wondering what would, if that study has been done all over again, what would it show in contemporary times? It would be an interesting study, actually.
Yes, I know we have a hand up, so maybe we can come back to my to my comments, although they're really brief, actually. So maybe if you don't mind, the person with your hand up, I'll just really briefly address this. I think for me, it really was a selfish exercise to see what we could find out. I had interest in decoloniality and still do. I also am a human rights person, and I had really seen those as very distinct areas of thinking. And I was really wondering, well, what if we try to put those together? What do we find? And I think the work of some of the authors from the Global South extended it further, right? Africanization, for example, is something I really hadn't thought about. And I know for those of you who might be interested, Andre can speak a little bit about also the way he sees decoloniality and Africanization being distinct, but also linked in his own context of work. So it was in that way, selfish for me to see what we would come up with. And what I personally concluded is that it is a very generative. They're very generative approaches individually of each other, and they do bring out different. They do highlight different concerns. I think with the human rights frame, it is so well established, and because we do have a legal dimension to it, obviously, that it just does set it apart from some of these other frames. Of course, anti-racism it shows up in laws, no question about that, in policies. But I think for me, it was also an exercise in thinking a little bit further about what a human rights approach to university might look like. And so other work I've done since this book is focusing on the rights-based approach in the universities. So for me, it allowed me to sort of, I think, extend my treatment of the human rights framework and to see, explore a little further. If we think about the university as a human rights actor, what does that look like? The thing is about using emancipatory human rights as a frame for the book is that there's so few people that are really using human rights as the lens to look at university work. And that I'm just putting that out there for all of you, because I think if you're in this virtual room, you are interested in human rights, you are interested in higher education, but we know the language that we find on campuses is along the lines of diversity, equity, inclusion, for example, or diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, perhaps. And decoloniality is a frame that's used primarily in teaching and learning practices, not exclusively. But so what I'm still uncertain about is, even as we move further in thinking about human rights as a frame, a critical frame back to human rights, but a frame also we can use for universities. Who's the audience here? Who's using this? And how do we really make this a meaningful exercise that might have some influence on practice? So I also end up with some questions that are unresolved for me. But we do, yeah.
Keith, I think you have a question.
First, I just want to congratulate Felisa and Andre on this great project and all the other people who were part of it. I'm looking forward to a steeply discounted copy to buy. And I apologize for not turning on my screen, as my mom used to say, I don't have my face on yet. It's very early in the morning for us here. I just wanted to share a concern and see some of the reactions from here. I really see myself as an academic historian of human rights, right? And so I'm seeing, as I've become more involved in this field and been teaching for the last over a decade now, and have several hundred students a year, if you saw my hands, you could see them going into a big U shape, which is that I'm seeing a growing gap between the academic study of human rights and then work that's taking place in human rights education. And so I'm wondering your thoughts about how to better integrate sort of the disciplinary work that's being done with the education part that must also be done. And I think this is actually fundamentally important, and it answers some of your concerns you just voiced now, which is the disciplinary language is still the primary currency on campus, even in the face of interpreting many of these justice and emancipatory elements through DEI. So I'll end the question there. I'm looking forward to teaching my 300 students today, but thank you again very much for this work.
You're very welcome, but may I invite you to share your own reflections then? What have you come to in terms of you said you're an academic, you're looking historically at HRE. What's your thinking about where we've come to?
Well, I was asking you, but so I think that the link is, I think it's being done very poorly, actually. And I say that to sort of stake out a pretty strong position. So what worries me is when the UConn model and the UC Davis model is to try to cross-list classes and bring them into established disciplinary fields and not sort of separate it out particularly. And then all courses have a disciplinary base. It could be sociology, art history, as they move forward, or sort of undergraduate legal studies. And the more that it moves sort of in the direction of School of Education approaches, the less it will find room within the established undergraduate curriculum. So that's one of my concerns. And so it's not a criticism, it's just a recognition of how the university works. And I think our conclusion was that one of the ways to really solidify a presence of a large undergraduate human rights program was to say, this is going to be interdisciplinary and disciplinary focused within a college. And so I think that works in a big West Coast research university. So that's my experience with it.
I must say, I find it, if I may, it's a very, very interesting observation, which is certainly also the case in South Africa, because that's one of the Karnoff Keet chapter actually shows that. And that is, you would have the conversion, the pedagogical conversion of disciplinary human rights within universities and outside universities is actually very weak. And part of the work that has interested me around the critical angle to human rights was precisely the fact that you may have critical disciplinary work that doesn't in any profound way influence the criticality of human rights education itself. So here, of course, is a very, very useful observation to take further in the way in which we try and see how that integration may happen. That the human rights programming chapter certainly shows the distribution of human rights in undergraduate studies as more or less this discipline focus. In fact, it doesn't come through very strongly in education either, or in the formulation of human rights education as a particular interest within universities. So for us as human rights practitioners or human rights education practitioners, I think it's a very, very productive observation. Thanks for that.
I think I'd like to add to it too. We think historically about human rights education in higher education. It's in the past, it was only the law schools. So I really want to acknowledge that we've already made, in my mind, incredible progress from even 20 years ago. If there was a human rights center, it was most likely at the law school. And we have, in fact, many examples of universities where they still have a human rights center at the law school, plus they have an interdisciplinary human rights center. So I think the interdisciplinary aspect actually is a kind of progress, but it does raise interesting questions about what next, kind of. I'm at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. We have Gergana Halpern here in the room, calling her out. Also, Paul Martin, who founded it. They, in my mind, are doing a really, really excellent job of having, and of course, Christina Eberbach also affiliated with that as the deputy director for so long. So a lot of people in this room here who can speak to the Columbia University experience, and I'd like to invite someone to do so. Here they have an institute. It's a standalone human rights interdisciplinary institute, and it has a combination of faculty who are associated directly with the institute and others that are affiliated through their appointment in their departments. And students really have the opportunity to be a human rights concentrator, so it's really serious. And in that context, to take a variety of human rights courses related to their interests. I'd also like to mention, before somebody hopefully from the Columbia campus pipes in, that when I was teaching the senior seminar in human rights for undergraduates, we had a few weeks looking at discipline-based approaches. So I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but I found it really fascinating because in these few weeks, by the way, and Andre, to your point, I agree completely that if we are teaching, I mean, maybe it's a kind of a general approach to human rights to maintain the critical approach. So even if we're teaching about human rights, we keep the critical approach, not only for human rights, but human rights as a leverage for change, if you will. In any case, this course that I used to teach, we had a few weeks of the critiques of human rights, but we also had discipline-based approaches. And it was really cool. And it was part of my favorite part about teaching the course. In fact, I'm working on a new book now where we're doing this, where we looked at, for example, economics and human rights, and what are the human topics of interest to human rights people that are addressed through economics, right? So agendas for economists to research that we might see as related to human rights, and vice versa. Research that is already being done naturally in the economics field that may be of interest to human rights people. So I do think when we think about the notion of discipline, which is perhaps contested, part of the decolonial question is, do we want to be thinking about disciplines as disciplines? But if we bear with that thinking, what is a discipline? It's key theorists, it's key concepts. Sometimes it's also very particular research methodologies. And I think that it's very interesting to consider those in light of the very wide field of human rights, which it is. It's a very wide field indeed. So just wanted to say that I think that there's actually, I'm really kind of excited that there's these interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach is now happening on campuses, and we have some better examples than other. I know, Andre, in your study for human rights education in South African universities, it was primarily in law schools. And I think if we were to do the same study here in the US, we'd probably find the same thing. But we do have some really good examples, I think, from Columbia. So I see, Corley, your hand is up. So I don't know if you want to go next, but I'd love also somebody from Columbia University, whether it's Christina or Gergana or Paul, to pipe in about what we're doing on campus there.
Okay, must I go now? Okay, so I'll be quick. First, I want to congratulate you on the book, and I hope, Andre, that there will be a copy that's damaged, that's cheaper that I can get. I will be glad to get it. Yes, I work at Department of Social Work at University of Pretoria in South Africa. About the university, I really don't know where the university is integrating human rights in other faculties than in humanities. I've never seen it. I don't know about it. But from my own research, I've discovered that a person cannot teach human rights if they do not understand it themselves, if they do not have their own experiences and interpretation of what happened to them, what is human rights for them. So I wonder if universities can start with the faculty members to do some human rights awareness and courses for people that actually have to talk about it. Because you will often find that lecturers violate students' rights in the classroom. So how will they speak about human rights if they don't act? Then the other problem that I have, we've got this world-renowned Center for Human Rights, also at the law faculty, but they're completely disconnected from the whole university. Completely, they're functioning as an entity on their own. They would be, South Africa's Human Rights Day on the 21st of March and so forth. They don't do anything to bring it together through the university. So the disconnect is really big. It's like an elitist group of people. So I find that it does not help advancing human rights at the university. And then I also just want to say for social work in general, I see Susan Gollifer is here as well. I feel that social workers at the moment are focusing just on one aspect of human rights, and that is activism. The rest of what happens in process, in transformation in people's lives, etc., are lagging behind, and it's creating currently where we are now a lot of division between people, and because of personal viewpoints, etc. But yes, so I think in social work there's also a problem in how we see it. That's just my observation. Thank you. I'm looking forward to read the book.
Thank you, Corley. Felisa, Andre, I don't know if you want to respond or we're getting a couple hands.
I think let PS first go so that if you don't mind, Christina.
Of course, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
And just to echo what everyone else said, thank you very much for presenting this really interesting and timely book. It's very interesting for me working here in the UK. I finished a professional doctorate 2 years ago looking at participatory action research using transformative pedagogies for citizenship and human rights in the UK context. And what I wanted to ask was about the role of academics. Here in the UK, our contracts are structured, which structures our time and our priorities around teaching, administrative work, and research. And in most universities, there's great emphasis placed on research, certainly in terms of prestige and for promotion. And looking at human rights education broadly, not just involving teaching and learning, but the running of a university, what role do the academics have in their classrooms, as well as institutional leaders, and not just leaders, but managers who are looking after that essential commodity in academia, which is people's time, where they can commit to some of these important activities that you set out in your book? So in short, does the book talk about the role of the people working in academia? And that might include the professional staff as well. Thank you.
Andre, you want to take that first?
No, thanks. There's a couple of those examples there, Piers, especially with regard to the ones that focuses internally on the university, those chapters, but perhaps not in a way in which you frame your question and within which you frame the problematic. But it is true that even in the mapping exercises that have been happening in the US, you would find a number of academics involved in the human human rights field, but also the human rights education field, also the human rights field outside of law, that's for sure. There's also a growth in critical human rights programming outside of law, as you may well know. There's some great examples in the UK and a few examples in the US as well. So that growth is certainly there. The first question that was raised is the troubling one, and that is that conversion within the academic spaces, about how that disciplinary buildup of knowledge and different sets of insights, how that gets converted into the work of academics themselves. And also touch on the question that Corley has also then raised. So here is the dilemma. In what ways can human rights within universities outside of law schools be configured in ways that provides for a justification of time spent on it? Okay, so that's a big question that the sector requires and needs to ask for itself. Of course, some universities will do better than others. Now, if you talk about the professionalization of human rights education or the professionalization of human rights work, then of course, to survive within the university space, it requires a very, very strong disciplinary knowledge base, even in different areas of work as well. And, I see that growth also happening slowly, but it's there. I'm surprised, Corley, because you are at a university with one of the strongest human rights centers on the continent, and then to say that they totally disconnect from the imagination of the university is very, very sad, as a South African, actually. But perhaps it is also, just a symptom of how the human rights field within universities are and have been taking shape. So perhaps Felisa and colleagues, at another time, we can spend some time on disciplinary formations in human rights and how disciplinary formations can convert into pedagogical practices within universities and the role of academics within that space. I think that particular mapping exercise and how that may happen will be very, very useful. I, for instance, have found the work that's been done in anthropology, for instance, very, very profound and insightful as far as critical human rights work is concerned. In law, of course, depending on what law school you are, I think it's the Warwick Law School. I don't know, Piers, you must assist to have this huge critical outfit that engages with the human rights regime. I think that's where Duzinas and those colleagues worked on within the UK. So that's the kind of work that I think that can advance the kind of disciplinary justification for spending time on human rights in the context of distribution of workloads of academics as well. So the question here is of course in our case, I think that human rights has retreated, okay, and that's, one can put it in different kinds of ways. I think that we had a stronger human rights practice and discourse probably 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I think that it has been overtaken by various other types of discourses. So one has to think about how one renew and revitalize the field over and over again. Because in a sense, Felisa, you're right, it is one of the strongest languages, for transformative work that one can find currently. So there's a kind of reinvestment that needs to happen there as well. Sorry for that long response. My apologies for that.
Yeah, no, it's great, Andre. I'm going to ask you a few things. Of course, Andre really has a direct experience with this because he's a vice chancellor, so he's a perfect person to address this very point. Just a few things really briefly. First is that we acknowledge in the book, we haven't talked about it, but what is the nature of transformation or even reform? So we have a little bit of time in the introductory chapter to recognize this kind of a spectrum. I think, Andre, you referred to it also. So you can have sort of minor changes, you can have major, and we have something like post-major, which is probably not realistic. It's like post-neoliberal approach to university, organization. But it's all to say that when we talk about transformation, we also need to think, what does that actually mean? And that's really relevant for your point, Piers, is that how you say your name? Piers? Okay, because we acknowledge also in the book that those who are reading it might be academics who see themselves as activists. Those of you in this room, again, probably you see yourself partly as activists, whether that's inside, outside the classroom, inside, outside the university. So we do know what areas of influence we have already by how we're teaching, what we're teaching, maybe influences inside of our department. And those are the kinds of areas that are not insignificant, but they're maybe, we would consider them fairly minor, right? But if we're talking about university-wide, or if we're a person who is subject to, as you said, peers, the the contract specifications, then we do need to speak about influencing others in the university setting, and that becomes moving us away from something minor to maybe something major. So I just want to acknowledge, though, that there is this sort of spectrum of change, and Andre and I have had this conversation recently. So even though I'm going to put the ball back into the Columbia University court so somebody can talk about the interdisciplinary studies there, Andre and I have talked about, Andre, remember fires on the margin? So we should get back to that for transformation, fires on the margin. So everybody, you'll know what that refers to after when we get back to Andre. In my own research, by the way, I'm looking at social work schools in the United States and which of those had a human rights or social justice frame, because the national standards in the United States for social work education actually require teaching social justice and human rights. They haven't compiled them, they've kept them discreet, and they are explicit. So it's fascinating that it is required. So I did some research with a former student on a subset of the social work schools that seem to have some language around social justice and human rights to see what that actually looked like. And as an aside, one of the things that we discovered, which is interesting, is that those social work institutions that had embraced human rights had one or both of the following qualities. One, it was working in international social work, so that the human rights language was part of the understanding that was given to students, because some of them might be going to do work in education and emergency, or rather social work in emergencies, humanitarian work abroad. So human rights came in because they were working in an international framework. And the second quality that came out was faith-based institutions. So those could be Catholic, for example, Roman Catholic, colleges, or in universities that were already very value-centered, and for whom extending that into either human rights or social justice was not so big of a reach. So it's very interesting that every university has its own, obviously its own histories and cultures, and those features of either the history or the programming made it, possible for them to have the human rights frame. Finally, and then maybe we go to Columbia University, if you don't mind. I do want to pitch this book. I am actually working on a new book. I swore I would, after this book, I submitted the manuscript, and I said, that is it. I did it. It's over. And then someone said, do you want to write a book? I'm like, well, maybe. So I'm actually also really fascinated by this question of disciplines and human rights education. So that's the book that's under development. We now have the chapter selected, and we're covering a range of disciplines. Again, we're going to have a critical eye also on disciplines, but I agree with you, Andre. I'm really fascinated about what anthropology has brought, new questions to human rights and culture. And we have a chapter. Each of the chapters in the book, we're going to look at sort of, if you will, kind of a historical rendering of the human rights frame with the discipline, and then looking at a contemporary issue that might be of interest to people teaching, in this case, anthropology, interested to link up with human rights. So just to say, that book is in the works, and hopefully it'll be out in a couple of years, we'll see. So could somebody from Columbia University talk about, I guess, Paul, you have your hand up, so why don't you talk about,
Can you hear me? Because I had a lot of problems getting on.
We're hearing you fine. Yep, loud and clear.
Well, I'll just go back. Columbia started the program in 1978, and the concept there was clearly one of, how do you mobilize resources already in the university into the field of human rights? So having almost educating the university about what human rights was about, and then things developed in different parts of the world. But we always had a sort of disciplinary committee, that would compose of the dean of schools, the chairman of philosophy, so that we had a sort of intellectual entree And that's been the model, essentially, the things. On the other hand, I mean, I've got to the stage now when human rights is not worth anything unless it's doing something, you see. And here you take, for example, things like global warming and AI. And I'm looking at human rights and saying, where are you guys? Even basic problems like world hunger, where is you guys? So I think the problem with the academic is they're in debating with one another, but the problems are out there. And I think that's where academia has to think, very much differently about these things. I mean, the Colombia issues now about Israel and Arab Islamophobia and things like that, they're the problems. And it's not something we sort of sit back and smoke our cigarettes to listen about and think about, etc. like that. So I think that's the challenge I think human rights has to face. How are we preparing? Because I always, when I was teaching, I'm retired now, I always felt when I looked at the students, I thought these characters are going to be around 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ahead. What's the world going to be like? How do we prepare them for that? So I think those are the sorts of drivers that I feel in the human rights field. And, my general feeling overall is to feel that human rights has got wishy-washy.
Gergana, would you like to add to that, or Christina?
I'll let Christina go first if she has any thoughts.
I'll try to be very, very quick. I think this question of I think disciplines can bring a lot to the study of human rights. And there's also, as Paul said, when you're starting the practical elements of what resources exist within a university. But I think it's also important that we're purposeful in what we decide is the core of what a human rights student needs to learn. And I think that shouldn't always just default to whatever courses are on offer. And I think as the field grows, maybe I'd be curious what you and others think, that there's a growing argument to be made that human rights could be considered its own discipline. But I think we have to explore what that is, like the core when we say someone is learning human rights, what it is they need to learn. And is it absolutely essential that there are certain various disciplinary perspectives and what disciplines are essential, I think is an interesting question. And certainly when we grappled with when looking at the major, but I'll turn it to Gergana now. But thanks for the question, Felisa.
No, thank you. And yeah, I very much agree with what Christina just said about the role of interdisciplinarity. And I think we've moved away, or I'd like to think that we've moved away from this notion that, it's all framed within the international legal framework. And we're now thinking about human rights through all of these different lenses and approaches. And the Institute for the Study of Human Rights runs an undergraduate major and a master's program. And in the master's program, all of our students are required to take a methods class, which is intended to give them a very comprehensive and diverse exposure to different methodologies, which are not necessarily always just limited to the social sciences. And so the idea is that, and a lot of students are actually more and more actively looking for other ways to examine human rights that are grounded in, for example, oral history or other methodologies that we haven't traditionally considered to be the human rights methodologies of the social sciences. And similarly, more and more students are moving away from being very legally focused in the way they approach the study of human rights and wanting to look at those issues through, whether it's through the lens of literature or history or anthropology or other related and adjacent disciplines. But one other thing that, and I should also note that the way our current major works still is very much it's rooted in disciplinary training in some respects, because all of our majors have to take what we call the specialization, and the specialization is intended to give them exposure to a particular discipline, a traditional discipline. So we very much still retain that component in some of the ways in which we train undergraduates. But the other thing I wanted to point out, which was a really interesting question, I apologize, I don't recall who raised it, which was the question of kind of the disconnect between the human rights education framing and teaching about human rights in higher ed institutions. I very much struggle with this in my day-to-day job, and I have noticed that there is at least from my observations, still some reluctance in terms of using the human rights education language when we talk about what happens in the classroom. I think that institutions such as Columbia are making some progress. It's very much framed around the language of inclusive learning and anti-racist pedagogies. It's not necessarily framed within the context of human rights education language. I mean, there's obviously a lot of overlap between those two, but it's just an observation that I have, which is curious, I think, because I think we're trying to get there, but I don't think we're there yet. So I'll keep it brief.
Can I check in here quickly with regard to Joseph and also Claude's note here in the chat? It's very, very fascinating because if the sense is that human rights have become wishy-washy, cause a particular kind of impotence emerging from the discourse and that particular realization, and then one has to think about what is it that makes the human rights then distinct from other things, because the things that people do, Joseph, is exactly to respond to the questions that you've raised. They perhaps are not using the human rights language, and maybe that is the question that we will have to ask. Why is the human rights language, in terms of its not only its linguistic formulations but also its legal formulations, why is that not the language that can speak to the question of AI or the question of climate change? Because the activist work are happening in that space, the pushback against techno-solutionism and all those kinds of works. And perhaps the task of some of the work that we need to do is if we frame human rights as that which has been codified from a normative frame, then perhaps we should separate and keep the normative frame separate from the legal codification. And under that normative frame, you would be able to cluster different sets of activist work, which you would generally exclude from being regarded as human rights. And once you do that, you can literally make the different sets of connections between the frames at play now, whether it's critical indigenous studies, whether it's decolonial studies and work, which of course are both languages that, at least in the US, overtaking both the language of civil liberties and the language of human rights. And in our context, of course, decolonization and Africanization. In my own mind, I actually don't have a big separation between those, because I call them in the way in which I work as activist frames for doing things, Joseph. So that's perhaps the way in which I read it and the way in which I drive the work that I do. I do find the kind of separation that sometimes come into play with regard to activist languages, I do find it somewhat unproductive, because I think that we should rather formulate an integrative way in which one provide for praxis and practical and pragmatic orientations to deal with the challenges that the SDGs purports to address. So that's and maybe that's some of the work that we will have to think through. That's the one. The second one is that I always wonder about whether, because the discipline in a sense not only means knowledge formations and knowledge architectures, but it also means to be disciplined, i.e. to be governed by conventions, okay? And and that's why we are our disciplines, because we are structured in the way in which we studies within our disciplines. And we will have to think as a field whether the ideal position of disciplinary knowledge is actually the one that will release the transformative potential of human rights. Because we may read it now as a disadvantage, it may well be a strength. So we will have to think carefully about how we think about these things. And the question about institutionalization as well, of this particular kind of work, because it comes with a form of domestication, and it comes with a form of disciplining as well. So one has to think carefully about the different sets of balances. But at another time, Felisa, I'll speak about the fires on the margin. I think I was so taken by I really like Joseph's intervention and also his Claude's intervention as well. It just makes the mind goes, as to how we can think the challenges of our field.
Thank you very much. Well, it's we're 5 minutes past, and I want to respect everyone's time, but I just want to thank both Felisa and Andre again for joining, and all of you, and leave you with the final word if there's anything else you'd like to say.
Just lovely to see you all here, and I'm so pleased that we are part of a larger group that's really interested to promote critical human rights education at the university. We know it makes a really big difference to our students, and it really positions our universities to make even greater difference in the communities they're based in. So thank you all for having us. Andre, nice to see you here, and so lovely to see old familiar faces as well as some new faces. Thank you, everybody.
Lizia, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you all very much.
Pleasure.